I'm Pastor Tom, and welcome to the Sunday Sermon.
You got to move. You gotta move. You got to move. You got to move. You got to move, child. You got to move. You gotta move. 'Cause when the Lord gets ready.
Please remain standing for the reading of the scripture. This is one of those weird weeks. I had everything done, and then I was just about to start printing printing the bulletins and sending them off to everybody, and this thing happened, and I ended up what I was going to preach today is now going to be next week, because there was this other thing that I had to talk about in the text. And this is usually the sermon has been sitting with me for a long time. Preparation for sermons is a little bit like cooking a good stew. You put the ingredients in the pot, but then it's got to cook for a really long time. And this was not quite normal for me. And so, of course, I had a work dream last night. You know what I mean? You know how those go? It's always bad. Work dream. I am going to read to you from Genesis chapter 40, starting in verse 8, going to the end of the chapter. So that's chapter 40, verses 8 through 23. Pharaoh's officials said to Joseph, "We have each had a dream, but there's no one to interpret it." And Joseph responded, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer went first. He told Joseph his dream, and he said, "In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches, and as it was budding, blossoms came down, and then clusters producing ripe grapes. Now I took Pharaoh's cup, which was in my hand, and I grabbed the grapes, and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and then I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is the meaning of this. The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you will once again put Pharaoh's cup into his hand as you did before." And then Joseph said, "Now, please do me a favor. Keep me in mind. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this place. For I was, in fact, kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here in Egypt, I've done nothing that should have put me into this prison." Now, the chief baker, seeing that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation to the cupbearer's dream, he said, "Well, let me tell you mine. I also saw in my dream three baskets this time of white bread on top of my head. But in the top basket, there was also all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds were eating them right out of the basket on my head." And Joseph said, "This is what this means. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and will hang you, and the birds will devour your corpse." And now it came about on the 3rd day, which happened to be Pharaoh's birthday, that Pharaoh made a feast for all of his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among all of his servants, and he restored the chief cupbearer to his former office so that he might put the cup into Pharaoh's hands. But he had the chief baker executed, just as Joseph had described. However, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, just forgot all about him. Let me catch you up in case you missed what's been going on in the story. Joseph, we meet Joseph when he's 17. He's the favorite son of Jacob, also known as Israel. And this does not endear Joseph to his brothers, nor does the fact that Joseph himself have dreams about, a future glory that he'll enjoy, which he is foolish enough to share with his brothers, and they start talking about killing him. Now, most of the time when brothers are like, "I could just kill that little snot," they don't mean literally to kill. They just mean, push him around or whatever. But Joseph has at least two brothers who are bloodthirsty maniacs. This would be Levi and Simeon. These guys are nuts. And they actually meant it. And so there's two versions of the stories, so in each version there's a brother who says, well, yeah, this happened, but I tried to help. So clearly a brother, maybe more than one brother, sort of said, maybe we shouldn't kill him. And the end result is that Joseph, instead of being killed, ends up being brought down to Egypt and sold into slavery. But he's sold into the household of a guy named Potiphar, who's a pretty important guy. And Joseph does a really good job and keeps advancing as, in his status as a slave until he finally becomes the major domo of the estate. So Potiphar literally thinks about nothing at all except his work, which he does for Pharaoh, but he doesn't have to worry about anything in the household estate. Joseph's got it all covered. The text actually says Potiphar didn't have to worry about anything except the menu, right? So this was who Joseph was. But then he becomes a victim of what nowadays we would refer to as workplace sexual harassment. And even though he does the right thing, he gets blamed. He becomes the whistleblower who gets blamed. And so he's accused of rape. And the fact that he's not executed on the spot strongly suggests that Potiphar suspected that Joseph was not guilty, but you gotta save face. You gotta keep up appearances. So Joseph gets thrown into prison, but it is not the deep dark dungeon where it's all terrible and bad, or there's a cell where you put in and forgotten all about. There's none of that stuff. He's in the Club Med, right? The Club Fed. Wasn't that what they call it? Club Fed nowadays. That's where the white collar criminals go. So he's actually in a better place than most, but he's still in prison. And he starts at the bottom and he does it again. He kind of works his way up until he becomes the right hand to the jailer. So that now the warden doesn't have to worry about anything. Joseph runs the place. And then this thing happens. The cupbearer and the chief baker of Pharaoh somehow do something, we don't know what it is, that offends Pharaoh. He throws them into the jail. And Joseph is given the additional job of taking care of them because they are important people. And so every day he's got to show up in the morning with their breakfast and, tend to their needs. And he's come one morning and they are dejected. Why are you so dejected? And they're dejected because they've gotten a glimpse of something in their dreams. They've had dreams and they know these dreams mean something. They understand what they mean. Let me rephrase that. They understand that they have significance. They themselves don't know what it means for them. And this bothers them. A glimpse of the greater reality without the understanding to go with it. And so Joseph's like, well, I got a little experience with dreams, so let me hear. And Joseph is confident that he understands the meaning of the dream, so he tells him, first the cupbearer, you heard it, hey, 3 days from now, you're going to be restored. And you understand where the baker's at, like, oh, good, this is a good one. Oh, whew, what a relief. These dreams are good dreams. Tell me what mine means, Joseph. Same thing, right? And only Joseph has bad news for him, that in 3 days he'll be killed. And it turns out exactly that way. By the way, the language, Pharaoh will lift up your head. So think of it this way. So the day comes, it's Pharaoh's birthday. He's going to gather all of his servants. Technically, these two guys who are in jail are still his servants. So they've been brought out, cleaned up, no doubt. Now, can you imagine how that would mess with your head if somebody said, yeah, you're going to get executed, to now be, you're like dressed properly for court. And everybody, has to kneel down and bow, and they bow your head before Pharaoh. And when Pharaoh calls those two guys' names, that means you lift your head. When you're called out that way, you lift your head. That's what it means to lift up your head. At least that's my understanding. That Pharaoh points these two guys out in front of everybody, and they have to move out of that sort of bent over position this way. Their heads are lifted up. And sure enough, one of them is executed, and the other one was restored just as Joseph described. Joseph, by the way, did not predict it. The dreams did. Joseph merely interpreted. And, of course, Joseph is forgotten anyway. The guy's so relieved. I think the one is so relieved that he doesn't even think of Joseph. Okay, you know the story. We're there. Think about this, Flo. I mean, it had to be cool for Joseph to be able to give somebody really good news. Like, oh, wow, I know what your dream means. But can you imagine what it felt like in that moment when before he says anything, when he hears the dream that the baker is going to have? He hears that dream, and he knows that it is not good news. I mean, can you imagine if he was like, one of us, a Minnesotan? He'd be like, oh, yeah, well, that's quite a dream you're having there, buddy. Yeah, well, I don't know. It's something's going to happen in 3 days, Yeah, you betcha. Okay, I'm going to go sit over here, right? Isn't that, because we don't want to say bad news. You and I do not want to share the bad news with anybody. We don't want to be the ones to have to tell somebody that hard truth. We don't. So we want to somehow avoid it or wrap it up in so much bubble wrap that it it somehow becomes a lie almost, because we've taken all the hard edges off. It'll be fine, really. It's because we want to be nice. But to do that, is that really kind? Right? Would it be kind of Joseph to not tell the baker what's going to happen? Certainly it would be nice of him. Oh, man, what a dream. Okay. But it wouldn't be kind of him. In this situation, the kind thing to do is to tell this guy the truth, because that now gives this man 3 days to prepare. Now, you and I both know he's probably with, I'm sure he's just a slave. What does he know? But he at least it's there for him to process, to be prepared. And I'm sure the moment they're bringing him out to see Pharaoh and they're having to prepare to go into the court, so they can't just go right out of prison, they've got to be properly dressed, that had to feel weird and maybe hopeful. I can't imagine how awful that would be emotionally for the baker. But he couldn't do that at all if it wasn't for the fact that Joseph had been willing to be not nice, to tell him the truth. And I don't know about you, I don't like sharing the bad news. I like to share the good news, but I don't like to share the bad news. We have a friend, actually, who, so he was part of, this marching band thing way back in the day, drum and bugle corps stuff. And so the group of these guys had been friends for decades, just really close. One of them had gotten cancer, and he'd been dealing with it for quite a while. And so everyone kind of knew he had cancer, but he's doing great. He's doing fine. He'll be good. Brad will be just fine. And it reached the point where it was not fine anymore. He was actually reaching the end of his life. Now, this guy, he doesn't have any family other than his mom. No siblings, no children. So it's him and his mom. He'd actually had to move in and live with his mom so that she could kind of help care for him while he was declining. And he's reached the point where she is not able to do that. So our friend, or friends plural, it's our friends. They're a couple. She's a nurse, and he's the old buddy from the old days, and the two of them have gone to help. So they're there almost every day, and they're really stepping up to try to help. The wife, our friend, she's a nurse, so she has made sure all the medication is right. She's arranged to handle the hospice. She's the one who's interpreting and making sure that hospice is understanding what's happening and the communication is all done right, because that's her area of expertise. And he was telling me, he called me on the phone, he was telling me this stuff, and he's saying, man, I've been changing diapers. I never thought I'd do that. So he wanted to make sure that all of the people in their friend group had a chance to say goodbye. So he, a week or two ago, they had a say goodbye party. Got everyone there. And he said it was a great time. He said, but everyone's like, oh, he's going to be fine. He's doing great. And it's our friend who has to say, no, he's not. He's dying. He's dying. You need to say whatever you got to say now because we don't know how much longer he's going to be here, but it's not that much longer. In other words, he had to be the one who was not nice, but who was kind. That is really, really hard to do. Now, one of the things that can happen when I say this, and I recognize this, is that sometimes what we want to do is we want to turn that into our chance to tell everyone else how to live their lives. Have you ever noticed how we're really good at telling other people what they ought to do, but not so good at taking our own advice? I don't know if you've noticed that, but I have. Like, well, you should go on a diet, or whatever. You're to this, you're to that. You should do this, you should do that. We do that with great ease and abandon and even joy. We love to tell other people what's wrong with them. We are not so good at hearing it spoken to ourselves. And so we'll do things to try to get around that, to try to maneuver our ways past that. I remember one church that I served, we used to go, and every Monday we'd go to like these different locations and do a church service. And two of them were like, one was a nursing home, one was a assisted living, and the third place was a Section 8, it was a HUD housing apartment thing, and everyone who was there was like on Social Security, disability, or something like that. And so we would go and we'd do a service, and every week there'd be this group of people, 10, 12 people, who would come to church just routinely. One day, I was in the middle of maybe the sermon, I'm not sure. This woman walks in, and I kind of knew who she was, but she wasn't like a part of she didn't come to the church. I'd seen her around and talked with her, but she wasn't coming to worship with us. But she'd come in and she said, I got to tell you something. I said, okay. I kind of gave her the floor. And she began to talk about how she was in her apartment and God spoke to her. And God was telling her how she needed to change her life and the ways in which she needed to do it, which included like becoming involved in worship and joining up with people who are worshiping, going to church or whatever, being part of that community of faith, being diligent about that. So that's what God was telling her. And so she starts to share that with us. And very, very quickly, it went from her talking about what God was telling her to do to her telling us what we needed to do, right? We needed to be the ones to go to church and stuff. She shifted that away really fast, that news. Now, that news, God telling her, you got to change your life, is that good news or bad news? Because sometimes bad news is still good news. Like sometimes that bad news is the thing that says, no, here's your opportunity to have a different outcome than you've had before. Here's a pathway from where you are now to a better place where you can be. But to do that, we have to recognize where you are now. That sounds like bad news when you tell people that, when you sort of confront that reality. But the better place, you got to know where you are to know where you're going. So was it good news or bad news that God says, oh, you need to change? Yes. Was it good news or bad news that Joseph ends up being unnice, but very kind when he says to the baker, this is what your dream means? Well, the bad news, of course, is what's going to happen, but the good news is now here's a man who's got time to prepare. So Joseph does the hard thing, and it's not the fun thing. If you've ever had to deliver the bad news, it is not fun. It is not fun to be I can't imagine for doctors, especially oncologists who are the ones walking in and saying, here's what's going on, to give that, yes, it is cancer, to say that thing that's really hard to say, but they need to do that. If they don't, we get a little upset with them. I've been the one sometimes to have to deliver bad news about a death when no one else in the family seemed willing to do it. How do we tell Mom? How do we tell Mom? I said, well, I'll go tell her. Right? But you got to do it. Somebody's got to say the truth of it. And so it's not fun, and it's not nice. But it's kind, and I think it's also gracious. And so when I read this story, it strikes me how Joseph is willing to be not nice for the sake of being kind. for the sake of being truthful, for the sake of doing something that really is better for this man than if he'd, oh yeah, your dream, oh, that's quite a dream there, guy. Okay, I'm going to go over here in the corner, right? And so again, another example of a person in the Bible, and I look at them and I think, I hope I can be a little more like that, a little more truthful, a little more kind, even if it means being a little less nice. Can you find the prayer of response? I don't like receiving bad news, O Lord, and I sure don't like delivering it either. Instead, I try to soften the blow, to wrap up the hard things so thoroughly that they become no better than a lie. But only the facts give me a chance to prepare myself for what is coming, and only the truth reveals the choices that lie before me. So grant me the love to speak truth and the grace to hear it clearly when spoken to me. Through Jesus Christ, I pray. Amen. We'd love to have you join us for in-person worship Sunday morning at 8:30 at Christ United Methodist, or Sunday morning at 10:15 at Stanton United Methodist. And if Sunday morning is not your jam, join us Monday night, 6 o'clock at Christ United Methodist for Pizza Church. It's church, and then we eat pizza. Until next time, may the Lord God bless you and keep you. May the face of the Almighty be upon you, and may God grant you peace.
Perfect peace. Oh, may God keep you in perfect peace.